Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to verse 30, found on page 739. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my God or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their house laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Nick, thanks very much for reading for us. Let me add my welcome to Tom. It's great to see you here at St. Nicholas Sunday morning. As Tom said, my name is Chris Fishlock, part of the leadership team here. We're in Daniel chapter 3. And in this chapter, what we see is God's people are so convinced that their God is powerful and just that they're prepared to stand against the flow of what everyone is doing around them and instead to stand for God, even if that means losing their own life. I tried to sum this up in the Friday email, if you see the email when it goes round. God is worth it, even to the point of death. God is worth it, even to the point of death. And I realized that that is a massively big thing to suddenly sort of throw into conversation on a Sunday morning all together. It's going to take a catastrophic gear change, isn't it, for our thinking to suddenly get in line with the proposition that I've already put before us. Let me try, therefore, to deal with the fact that I'm sure we're all still a little bit distracted. It's been a busy week. There's a lot that's gone on. Tummies are starting to rumble. Lunch is not far off. And there's a busy afternoon. All of these things sort of crowd into a normal Sunday meeting. That's fine. That's normal. We would expect that to happen as we come to church, as we come to Bible teaching. We're going to have all the distractions and busyness of the world sort of flying around our heads. So let's try and ease into this subject matter. Remember, we're dealing with something that just doesn't sit very easily. God is worth it. The Christian God of the Bible is worth it, even to the point of death. Big proposition. Let's just spend a few minutes, therefore, thinking about some of the pressures that we're used to facing in this world. And this will affect everyone, whatever side of the Rubicon you're on in terms of belief. I mean, you may remember what it was like at school as a teenager. Good memories, bad memories, for all of us, I'm sure, mixed moments. But just remember some of the huge pressure that you first experienced. Certain behavior, certain activity, the language that's used. When you start to swear, I mean, everyone swears, so when do you start to swear? What words do you use? Everyone does it. The culture of smoking, the culture of vaping, drinking, skipping class, different pressures at different times. I remember a conversation with a family member, not one of my children, and this individual said to me, "I think things are just different in London, Uncle Chris." That gives some clues to who it is. "I think things are just different in London. Round here, every child goes to bed way after midnight." He was 13. Pressure to conform to the latest style. Not having the correct shoes or jeans or whatever can seem like social suicide at some point in our lives. In the last 5 years, I mean, particularly the whole sort of social media world has compelled many to post certain types of messages, certain looks, certain comments to generate followers to get the approval that's needed. The office culture, we've got a little bit of an insight from Neil earlier. The office culture you'll be familiar with, the majority of the team or the boss. I mean, to leave before them sometimes can feel like career suicide. Endless examples. Think of what it's like when you're in a conversation and you suddenly realize that your political views or your family values are massively out of step with what everybody else around you is saying. If you have small children, you can feel the pressure to parent in a certain way. Criticism can seem devastating, unfair. Every stage of life will give us almost endless examples, opportunities to feel the pressure. You've got to do something in a certain way. It's because everyone does it. Little things can seem a little bit irrelevant sometimes, but actually the little things, all of those sort of stuff, they're quite good training ground. Depending on the issue, the little things will help us prepare for the big things. Now, on the ground in Babylon, our three main characters, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're facing a defining moment in their lives. We need to keep this in perspective. Now, we're dealing in these early chapters with the exile. That's a real historical event. You'll remember back in chapter 1, Daniel and the three friends, they arrived in Babylon in 605 BC, chapter 1. By the time Daniel gets chucked in the lion's den, that's chapter 6, it's 539 BC, right towards the end of the exile. Not quite there, but nearly there. They were in exile in Babylon for 70 years. And so we jump from chapter 1 to chapter 5, about 65 different years and incidents. Endless conflicts with the authorities maybe, but we don't get a lot of details. We only get very, very few life and death situations. And it's reasonable to point out in terms of us, I mean, most of us probably will never face a life or death situation in terms of our Christian faith. We'll never have a defining moment like this. The extreme examples, they come up in the Bible, they come up in church history after Bible times, and they can be very interesting and inspiring for us, reminding us, of course, as God's people, that we are naturally at loggerheads with this world. We're at conflict with this world. The word that the Bible uses for God's people is consistently exiles. That's fitting for Daniel, and that's New Testament language too. We're exiles in conflict with the world. Lots of times we can coexist. Every now and then there's a punch-up because the values that God gives his people are in conflict with the world. These historic events, I mean, these things actually happened. We need to remember that. And they can inspire us to take a stand. And that brings us to the first point. I mean, the huge pressure to go with the flow. We're going to try and sort of relive this a little bit for our characters here. I mean, we're in chapter 3. There's an unknown amount of time has passed since chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar feels he needs a bit of attention. He wants a bit more adoration. And so he sets up this image in verse 1, an image of gold, 60 cubits high and a breadth of 6 cubits. Now, this thing here is about 6 cubits wide, maybe maybe it's about 5 cubits. So just a little bit wider than this. And 60 would be 90 feet high, so a bit higher than this room. Let's give some idea. Massive gold image dominated the sort of Babylonian skyline, I guess. Maybe it was set up on a pedestal too. Now, you remember the dream in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and in that dream, the head was gold, and then the body and the arms and the legs and the feet and everything, they were made of other materials. The dream was interpreted. The head of gold is you. Well, now, here is an image made just of gold. You see, as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, there was no other kingdom that counted for anything. Gold kingdoms were all that matter. This is Nebuchadnezzar's sort of stand, Babylon forever. The word went out. This act of defiance needed to be appreciated. Bring everyone for the dedication. And the announcement, verse 4, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace." You see, every now and then, an opportunity, a defining moment will come our way. A principled stand can be taken, sometimes against an antagonistic individual or a sort of larger set of principles. The pressure to go with the flow is huge. And look how the sort of text draws that out. I mean, first we're sort of drawn attention to the powerful voices. I mean, human nature, we find it impossible, don't we, not to be led by the person that's speaking. I mean, if it's just a colleague that asks you to do something, you give it a certain amount of respectful weight. If it's a line manager, it gets more weight. If the CEO comes in and says, you need to do this, I mean, you're not going to sort of say, oh, I don't know if I need to pay attention. King Nebuchadnezzar, we're told, verse 1, verse 2, twice, verse 3, verse 5, verse 7, verse 8. King Nebuchadnezzar is behind this command that goes out. I mean, this is the command from the king. What are you going to do, peoples of the land? And then there's the pressure of the crowd. You get this wonderfully sort of curious list: the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. You get it repeated in verse 3, just in case you missed it in verse 2. Everyone is there. Everyone who is anyone is there. They've fallen in line. It helps to rub home the unstated pressure. You must do what the sensible people, all the sensible people, what the establishment, this is the direction of travel. Are you really going to do anything other than this? Can you think of a time when you personally were last under pressure to do just what was expected of you? You knew it wasn't the right thing to do. I recently met with one of the chaps who comes along here on a Thursday lunchtime. It wasn't with Neil, one of the other guys that comes, not with us on a Sunday. He's called Tim. He works in an investment bank. He's been there for about 15 years in that whole sort of world. And he's been a Christian all that time. I had a great chat with him about what office culture was like. And afterwards I thought, wow, that was so helpful. That's going to be quite useful in this Daniel series that's going on. And I couldn't really remember what he said, so I asked him to write it all down. And he wrote a lot more details. It was very good. Here are a few sort of highlights of it. He says, there's a real focus in this particular bank for staying around for a long time. It's considered a really honorable thing to build a long career at the firm. And because of this, there is an inevitable culture of fear, of getting something wrong, of being conspicuous, of not keeping the right people happy, of doing the expected workload. The pressure is huge. It's a self-preservation thing, but ultimately means people are afraid to stand out or stand their ground. They often can't be themselves. Tim concludes here, it's ironic because corporates peddle so much bring the real you to work nonsense, but I'm really not sure they actually mean that. The pressure comes from people around us, voices from up high, telling us we need to conform. It's really hard. And it's not just those sort of unstated voices. Every now and then there's, what happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? There's the sort of the malicious accusation as well. Verse 8, therefore at that time the certain Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians, they came forward, maliciously accused the Jews. The pressure is increased. When I was working in financial services before I went into church work, quite early on in a company that I joined, someone in my team told the team leader that I was a Christian. This was all in the first sort of few days. Now, that's not an unhelpful thing. We were talking about that in chapter 1, weren't we? It can be really useful to sort of nail your colors to the mast early on. And in theory, that's right. I told a few of my colleagues. The problem was my team leader was a total nutcase and acted irrationally all the time, apart from a very few incidents, which obviously made him the team leader. Anyway, he singled me out in front of everyone else quite early on. He said, hey, Fishlock, and, there's a lot of people listening in this point. Fishlock, you really believe all that Christian rubbish? Now he used very, very colorful language at this point that I really can't repeat, but the point was very clear. You're actually going to align yourself with those Christians? The overwhelming pressure just to go with the flow. Now in Babylon, the spotlight is on our three friends. They're hauled before Nebuchadnezzar, and they're threatened again with the fiery furnace. This time it's the sort of personal appeal to conform. Verse 14, the king speaking, you can imagine him sort of getting alongside. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true, verse 14, you won't do this thing? You must do this thing. Everyone's doing this thing. There'll be really serious consequences, don't you understand? Here is the voice. It's classic, isn't it? This is 2,500 years ago. Here is the voice of religious and political progressiveness. Stepping boldly into untested territory, this brand new edict goes out and declaring that if you don't do it, anyone who doesn't do it will be cancelled. No tolerance, no room for maneuver. Nebuchadnezzar is the arch-liberal in here. How easy it would have been at this point, after the personal appeal, how easy it would have been for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just to say, yes, Your Highness, that's a really good point. Can we just have a moment and to chat this? And you can imagine them almost sort of gathering around and saying, well, it's just a small thing. We could cross our fingers and bow. I mean, after all, we're quite senior now. We're having huge influence. Just this small thing. He's not asking us to say we don't believe in the true God. Just this small thing, and then will be really useful. I'll keep my head down now. They don't do any of those things. Instead, they reason, the God of the Bible, the Christian God, is worth standing for, whatever the cost. They don't need convincing. And that brings us to the second point, making a stand. Shadrach, Meshach, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." In other words, we don't need time to think about this or talk about it. We know where we stand. You can almost imagine them as king is sort of appealing to them personally, just shaking their heads, just saying, no way, you're not going to convince us. We know where we stand. What's the basis of their confidence? It's worth just sort of observing this. You'll see two parts to the basis of their confidence. I haven't written on your handout, but you may want to sort of make a note, 2 subpoints to point 2. First is that God is powerful to save. That's the first sort of plank of their reasoning. You see that in verse 17. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. See, in their mind, King Nebuchadnezzar has never been in charge. He may be the king, but they have a God who, even in their short lives, has an incredible track record of success. I mean, they know the stories from their childhood, from their Jewish history. They know the stories like the Exodus and the Passover. They saw firsthand the temple back in Jerusalem. They were aware of the covenants and the sacrificial system. They knew how this God operated. And they'd already seen this God operating in their lives. They'd witnessed firsthand God working in their situation at the start of the exile, back in Daniel, where they made a stand with the meat and the wine. They were party to Daniel's prayer request in chapter 2. They faced death then. All of the wise men did. They had a miraculous answer to prayer. God told them the dream and the interpretation. They were absolutely confident about God's ability. And for us too, there's a wonderful thing that happens when you read this text through a few times. It's almost like there's another way of reading the first half. Let me explain what I mean. See, let's just assume, I know there'll be people with us from all sorts of different starting points in terms of accepting of Christianity and sort of investigation of, and that's normal. We always have a range of people with us, and that's great. But let's just sort of come with me for a moment. Assume that you're sort of with us in terms of what Daniel has established so far in this book. That we have witnessed the God of Daniel 1 and 2, and that we'd been sort of fully on board with the declaration that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had made himself back at the end of chapter 2. Just glance back to chapter 2, verse 47. Nebuchadnezzar said at the end of that miraculous dream statement and interpretation, surely, right at the end of verse 47 there, the start of 47, surely your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings. And so as an on-side reader, we come to chapter 3 with a slightly different take on these things. 8 references to King Nebuchadnezzar. That stands in contrast to the whole of the rest of the book, actually. Certainly the rest of the chapter, there's a sort of disproportional number of references to King Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost like as readers we're meant to be saying, but he's not the king, not the real king. Nebuchadnezzar himself has just said there's a Lord of kings. You can almost sort of put a pantomime spin on this. King Nebuchadnezzar, oh no, he's not. King Nebuchadnezzar, oh no, he's not. That's sort of what we're meant to say. And you can get that all the 7 times that it comes up. And then there's the musical instruments. You think, what sort of lame party is this? Who brings a sort of, all this sort of ridiculous charade of musical instruments? As we were going through this in the run-through, one of the ladies said, it's like a sort of Gilbert and Sullivan operetta here, sort of poking fun at itself. It all starts to get a little bit ridiculous. And then there's that sort of list of satraps and prefects and governors and counselors. And once you start thinking of Gilbert Sullivan's soundtrack, the whole thing just really starts to sound ridiculous. But then if you're not convinced by any of that, the biggest clue of all, it comes 9 times through the text up until the final one is in verse 18. 9 times we get this expression, the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up. The image that Nebuchadnezzar himself set up. He set it up. It's a setup. It's a setup. Do you get it? It's almost unbelievable. We're being told through the text that this whole thing is a charade. This whole thing has no value. And so it's like Daniel is telling us as readers, don't worry, God has got this whole thing in his hands. However serious, however hot, quite literally, the climate gets, God has got this. And here's the point for us to sort of really think about and take home. God never requires you to sin. That means to turn your back on God, to honor him. God never requires you to sin at any point in your life, to honor him. Our reasoning can quite often let us down, can't it? You find yourself thinking, well, just a tiny mishap here, a little white lie there, and then I'll be able to serve God and carry on in those other areas. You're wrong. God will never require you to cross a line like that for him. Instead, well, this is the sort of the logical second sub-point. So the first one is that God is powerful to save. Secondly, even if God doesn't save, we won't do what the world around says. Verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. It's an inspiring example, isn't it? Inspiring example in the face of imminent death to say that to the king. Back in those days I was talking about when I worked in the city, there was one of the things that sort of was going on in the news at that time. It was that dreadful shooting in Columbine, Columbine High School, Colorado. It was April 1999, and 12 kids were shot, and a teacher, before the 2 kids with guns who were members of the school, turned the guns on themselves. And it really hit the headlines. I think there are a lot of high school shootings that don't hit the headlines. This was one of those ones that just sort of gripped the world as far as many of us were concerned at the time. It was turned into a documentary. Some of you might see Bowling for Columbine. There was a lot of chatter about what had happened, and stories came out. Stories started circulating about how Christians particularly were singled out in that high school, shot for being Christians. Apparently the gunman went up to certain people and said, "Are you a Christian?" And people were forced to look down the barrel of the gun and answer the question. Lots of children paid the ultimate price. I remember the report having a huge effect on me at the time as these things were sort of coming out, how brothers and sisters, children, had looked down the barrel of the gun, been asked a simple question, paid the ultimate price. I mean, I found it really inspiring. I mean, it was quite a difficult environment that I worked in financial services, and I found it really, really inspiring. I faced sneers. I faced a loss of reputation, jokes from my totally psychotic team leader at the time. I mean, that was just so small compared to the sort of stuff that was actually happening in our world today. God is powerful to save. But even if he doesn't save, he is still worth standing for. And the final point helps to vindicate this rather radical perspective. I mean, Daniel does give us some radical perspectives here. And the point is simple. In the end, whatever happens, we can be absolutely sure of the outcome. We slow down at verse 19. There's a massive change in pace. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression on his face was changed. It's like the sort of the camera pans. We get the close-up, and we see his face just going redder and redder with rage. He explodes. How dare anyone cross me? Then the pace quickens. The fire is stoked. Innocent people die stoking the fire, and then our 3 friends are bound into the fiery furnace. Let's just rejoin the story in verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." The 4th man, an angel possibly. Some commentators suggest a pre-incarnate Jesus. The point that matters, God is with his people in the fire. However we interpret that fourth man, God is with his people in the fire, and that is always true. He doesn't promise to protect or shield us from the hardships of this world, but he is with us, whatever we are going through. And he will save us through whatever we face and bring us safely to the other side, to his kingdom for eternity. That is always true. And so this scene functions to show us a picture of the miraculous rescue that God does promise in the end. He doesn't shield us from hardships. We won't necessarily get career success if we make a stand. We may well lose our jobs, or worse. He will carry us safely through, so we can be sure of the outcome. I mean, in that sense, this miracle in chapter 3, it's not normative, but it is a blueprint. It points to a miracle that absolutely is normative. And that's the resurrection of Jesus. You see, Jesus rose from the dead 600 years later. Jesus actually rose from the dead. That is the point that brings us together. I mean, at the point in this world's history where somebody conclusively decides or establishes that Jesus did not rise from the dead, I mean, we're all wasting our time. That's the defining moment of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus. This, in a sense, points very clearly to that. And that is normative. That is a picture of what will happen to every one of us. There is life after death. Now, I realize there'll be people with us today who are either with us or listening online or perhaps listening to a recording later on. You're actually thinking, you expect me to believe that 4 men walked around in a furnace, didn't even smell of smoke in the end? Are you nuts? I think it's a fair enough question, but remember, we're not dealing with a set-up God. We're dealing with a creator God, a God who created this world out of nothing, and a God who raised Jesus from the dead. The fact the world exists is undeniable. The resurrection of Jesus, I'd like to suggest you come to the same conclusion when you look at it. Christian gospel stands or falls on these things. And for those of us who believe that Jesus rose from the dead, I tell you, 4 men walking around in a furnace is pretty small fry compared to that. That's worth thinking about. So as we draw to a close, I mean, just look back at verse 15. Back at verse 15 in the text at the end, there's a question. There's a question that needs answering. If you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hand, says Nebuchadnezzar. End of verse 29, we get the answer from Nebuchadnezzar, fittingly. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. We can be absolutely sure of the outcome in the end. And there's a wonderful sort of final comment that's just worth homing in on, verse 30. Right at the end of the chapter, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Not many people would have predicted that when they made their stand. How to get a promotion. Cross your fingers, put your head down, put your backside in the air. That's the way we're going to get promoted. Not at all. The God of the Bible is worth it. And he says, don't compromise, always stand. You will always be promoted in the end. I can assure you, the life to come is a massive promotion on this life. This life is as close to hell as we will ever experience as Christians. The life to come is pure, eternal joy. But it's always right to stand. God is worth it, no matter what's at stake. Let me just conclude with a final thing that Tim said. Tim, he's the investment banker, 15 years, Christian, and he says this. He tries to take this attitude into the workplace. He says, if you aren't afraid of the consequences, you are free from this fear, the fear that he's described in his place of work. And you can be yourself. You can hold your position with confidence. For example, you can say no when it's not the right thing to do. In short, if I were to get shown the door, whilst it might not be ideal, it's fine. And I'm not afraid. As we know that God blesses the integrity of our motive and conduct, even if it's not immediately favorable circumstances. In the end, we can be sure God will always carry us through. Why don't we close in prayer? For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Our Heavenly Father, help us to consider carefully the radical challenge to be reminded and to be encouraged that standing for you, for truth, is always worth it, whatever the cost. In Jesus' name, amen.